May it please this honorable court, I'm Daniel bin Kamarizam on behalf of plaintiff will reply to the defendant's argument in regards of the first, second issue and fifth issue. My ladyship, the defendant contended in their first issues that plaintiff have no serious question to be tried, as plaintiff is a third party as in a sale and purchase agreement between the defendant and Muhibah Sendian Berhad who will receive the payment in the sum of 2,000 ringgit Malaysia contended as the balance of default debt by the defendant. The defendant contended in their second issue that the debt between plaintiff and defendant is payable and monetary compensation without injunction is adequate. Therefore, this modified injunction should not be granted. Meanwhile, the defendant contended in their fifth issue had plaintiff had failed to make full and frank disclosure on the real purpose of the application of injunction and the harm upon plaintiff if the injunction is not granted. My ladyship, I wishes to direct my ladyship in regards of these contentions to the purpose of this injunction application by plaintiff. As I had submitted in the main submission, the purpose of Mariva injunction application is to prevent the asset of foreign company in default of being removed or dissipated or involved in any pending judgment in the main action. Allow me to refer the case of Meng Sendian Berhad and Joel Hugo Smith, which stated that the above case of Astrada Sendian Berhad had described the need to this remedy in order to keep the assets of a foreign defaulted within the jurisdiction to prevent injustice caused to a successful litigant. The aim of such an injunction is not to provide a plaintiff with a security of claim, but to restrain a defendant from putting his asset out of the plaintiff reach in order to defeat a judgment. Thus, plaintiff submit defendant had admitted to have entered into sale and purchase agreement with Muhibah Sendian Berhad, although plaintiff is named as the third party in the agreement, which would receive a sum of RM 200,000 ringgit, but the agreement is not in the knowledge nor agreed by the plaintiff. Therefore, this Mariva injunction application is the most suitable option for the plaintiff pending judgment of the main action. The issue of adequacy of monetary compensation is not relevant as defendant had already closed their company in Malaysia. Thus, brought the plaintiff to make this application of Mariva injunction in order to protect plaintiff rights on the default sum, which is yet to be determined and likely to be decided in favor of. Further, plaintiff wishes to emphasize on plaintiff's submissions that the purpose of this injunction application is to prevent defendant from dealing with their asset in this jurisdiction pending judgment. As the defendant is a Singaporean-based company which had closed down their company in Malaysia and intended to focus on their main company in Singapore. Thus, there is a risk of default payment by the defendant if plaintiff did not take action. Furthermore, defendant contended that they had entered into a sale and purchase agreement with another company in which it is not in plaintiff knowledge. Thus, if plaintiff slip on their rights, the judgment in main action, if decided in favor of plaintiff, would be in vain in the situation which the agreement is not valid or just a front to cover the removal of the asset from the jurisdiction.
May it please this honorable court, I, Muhammad Karandam and Zulkifli, will continue from here on. My ladyship, I will reply to the 6th, 7th, and 8th issue from the defendant counsel submission. For the 6th issue, the defendant submit that plaintiff did not prove there is a serious risk that the asset will be disposed by the defendant. Further, the defendant contend that there is no real risk of the asset being disposed as defendant had informed the plaintiff on the closing of their company in Malaysia. For the 17th issue, the defendant submit that by granting the injunction, it will interfere with the right of the third party, namely Muhibah Sendian Berhad, on the sale and purchase agreement already entered into between Muhibah and defendant. Further, it will be difficult for the definitive to be repaid of the sum 200,000 ringgit Malaysia, which had agreed to be transferred to the plaintiff upon the purchase of the defendant asset. For the eighth issue, defendant submit that Maribat injunction should not be granted as defendant can provide for security of the payment of the debt, which is already stated in the specific clause in the sale and purchase agreement with Muhibah and Sdn Bhd. My ladyship, for this submission from the defendant on behalf of plaintiff, I wish to direct my ladyship to plaintiff's submission on the power of this court to lift the corporate veil, as had been stated by my co-counsel in plaintiff's main submission, referring to the case of Astrada Sdn Bhd against Bank Wiputra Malaysia Berhad. It stated that the court could generally lift the corporate veil in order to do justice, particularly where an element of fraud is involved, where the consequences of lifting the corporate veil had resulted in a person who had the defendant in original action being as an alter ego of the appellant, who appealed against Maribat injunction against him. It was also held that after the corporate veil had been lifted, it was appropriate to grant Maribat injunction. Further, plaintiff also referred to Civilized Engineering Sdn Bhd against Stage B Resources Sdn Bhd, which plaintiff wished to emphasize that lifting corporate veil in a Maribat injunction is necessary in interest of justice to ensure that the injunction will not be granted in vain. In this application, before my ladyship today, plaintiff submit that lifting the corporate veil is necessary on Muhibah Engineering Sdn Bhd as to prevent a fraud, if any, from the defendant and Muhibah relation in the sale and purchase agreement. Plaintiff, in fear that defendant asset will be removed or dealt with the pending judgment in the main action, contend that Muhibah Sdn Bhd is an alter ego of the defendant in order to run from their responsibility toward plaintiff. The reason for this contention is plaintiff did not have any knowledge, nor did plaintiff agree to the sale and purchase agreement entered into between defendant and Muhibah. Although defendant claimed that there is a clause which stated that plaintiff will get the sum of 200,000 ringgit Malaysia as the payment for the default sum. Furthermore, the defaulted sum is yet to be exactly determined pending trial. Thus, in reply to defendant's 6, 7, and 8 issue, there is a risk of dissipation of the asset as defendant had closed down their company in Malaysia and plaintiff did not have knowledge on the sale and purchase agreement with Muhibah Sdn Bhd. This application of injunction will not interfere the right of third party, which is Muhibah Sdn Bhd. This application of injunction which as plaintiff refused to sleep in his right of the default sum and for fear of Muhibah Sdn Bhd being an alter ego or just and cover for defendant responsibility. And lastly, this Maribat injunction should be granted in favor of plaintiff in sequence of lifting the corporate veil of Muhibah Sdn Bhd for reason as I have already stated just now.
May it please this Honourable Court, Nur Azharina binti Zulkifli will proceed with the reply in regards of the third and fourth issue in defendant's submission. The defendant contended in their third issue that this application of injunction shall be dismissed as plaintiff had failed to undertake the damages. If in any event the plaintiff's application is dismissed, the defendant will have remedy prepared for if defendant suffered loss. My Ladyship, plaintiff had submitted in main submission that plaintiff undertake for the damages to defendant in the event where the judgment is in favour of defendant, and plaintiff would readily assist the court if ordered to provide evidence of the undertaking. For further assistance, I refer to paragraph 34 of plaintiff's written submission on the issue of undertaking. Then, the defendant contended that the balance of convenience in this case does not lie in the favour of plaintiff, as granting the Maribat injunction will harm the defendant in a way that it will interrupt the settlement process of the sale and purchase agreement between defendant and one Muhibah Engineering Sdn Bhd, in which plaintiff is the third party who will receive a sum of Rm 200,000 for the settlement of the default sum claimed by plaintiff. The defendant also emphasized that if the injunction is granted, then the sale and purchase agreement cannot be continued and executed, thus will cause the plaintiff to be unable to cover the sum of Rm 200,000 owed by the defendant to plaintiff. My ladyship, I wish to remind this court that the matter of the defaulted sum is still pending on trial, in which the plaintiff and defendant both claim a different amount of defaulted sum. This matter does not yet determined by the learned judge in the main action. Thus, plaintiff contended that the defendant has misdirected this court onto making decision based on their side of facts without taking into account the main issue in the main action. Further, my ladyship, I wish to quote a case which had already been submitted by plaintiff in the main submission, which is the case of Interstate M and E Sdn Bhd against Foresight Trading Sdn Bhd in paragraph 26, where balance of convenience is explained, which, if I may quote, it is now the practice that in all cases where interim or an interlocutory injunction is sought for, the court must accordingly decide what, on balance of convenience, is the right order, and where lies the major risk of damage, and in particular of any irreparable damage. My ladyship, plaintiff wishes to emphasize on the phrase where lies the major risk of damage, and in particular of any irreparable damage, where in this case, plaintiff strongly believes that the major damage will be inflicted onto plaintiff of the injunction if the injunction does not granted, as defendant had entered into the sale and purchase agreement with Wan Muhibah Sdn Bhd, which plaintiff did not have any knowledge of, nor did plaintiff agree on the terms and sum payable stated in the clause of the sale and purchase agreement. In addition, my ladyship, plaintiff also relied on the case of Satellite Engineering Sdn Bhd against THB Resources, which in paragraph 28 stated that on this issue, based on the whole facts of the case, I found that the balance of convenience ought to be in favor of plaintiff. If the defendants are left with the liberty to dispose of their assets as they please at the junction, the plaintiff would suffer grave injustice by not being able to claim the fruit of its litigation in the event if the judgment is found in its favor. In relation to this case, I wish to state that once again that plaintiff intend to persuade this court to leave the corporate will of Muhibah Sdn Bhd, as plaintiff feared that Muhibah is an alter ego of the defendant, or just a cover to shadow their true intention to dispose their asset. If the injunction is not granted, or the sale and purchase agreement is allowed to be executed, plaintiff will suffer a great injustice by not being able to get the fruit of its litigation if the judgment is decided in its favor, in the event either defendant had released their responsibility to pay, or that the agreement stated with Muhibah is only for sum of Rm 200,000. In addition, the freeze of the sale and purchase agreement will not cause any major risk on the defendant nor Muhibah Sdn Bhd, as the asset in question is the building of defendant's company, which had already been closed down since the end of 2019. The injunction will not interfere of any ordinary use of defendant nor Muhibah Sdn Bhd. Thus, plaintiff submitted that the major damage will be inflicted to plaintiff. Thus, balance of convenience is in favor of plaintiff. That's all. Thank you.